Hello, everyone. Hello to my guests.
Hi.
Hi. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this Hire panel webinar on tech recruiting for startups and early stage teams. I think as we all know, the hiring world is still in a really strange place. So we're joined by three excellent guests who can help us navigate through the storm. So hi to Yvonne, Scott, and George. Could you all introduce yourselves to start with and your experience to give a bit of context? Maybe Yvonne first.
Shall I go first? Okay. So hi, everyone. I'm Yvonne. I am a talent management professional at Lloyds Banking Group, and I completely understand we're talking about startups right now. I've been with Lloyds for the past 5 months supporting their technical business, but prior to working at Lloyds, I have essentially worked in startups and scale-ups for the majority of my career. I'd say most notably at Hopin, which is where I worked prior to Lloyds. Hopin is a virtual events platform that came into an amazing journey during the pandemic. It was equally exciting and quite scary working as a tech recruitment leader there. So really excited to sort of share some experiences that I've got here. And yeah, hand over to Scott.
Yeah, hello, my name's Scott. So currently a senior talent manager at checkout.com. We're a fintech in the payments industry. Again, similar to Yvonne, obviously working relatively big company now, but previously to this was working at Improbable Worlds, which was a large distributed systems gaming company that focused on like building large scale real world environments and massive games, and they're now focusing on like building the metaverse. So previously helped grow them from 150 to 1,000 people, which is probably quite relevant to today's topic, and previously spent 8-9 years in agency recruitment, focusing predominantly on banking and finance. Over to you.
Hey, I'm George. I'm head of talent at Lindus Health. We're a next-gen CRO, which is a clinical research organization, fixing what we believe to be the biggest bottleneck to improving human health, which is the broken clinical trials process. I was previously a venture-backed startup founder. I co-founded Prologue, which is a candidate-first ATS for startups. And I was also a managing partner at Talentful after 5 years as an in-house talent leader. Over the course of the past 10 years, I've predominantly focused on working with seed through Series C stage companies looking to set up and then scale effective talent functions.
Cool. Thanks, George. I suppose I should introduce myself as well. So I'm Phil. I'm one of the founders of Talentful. But prior to Talentful, I led early stage talent teams for Thought Machine, Mind Candy, and Magic Pony Technology. So I have a little bit of experience in this space, but not as much as these guys, certainly recently anyway. So I'm going to kick off with the first question, which is the kind of headline, I suppose, really. So I want to ask the panelists, what are some great tips for talent leaders when they're starting out to approach tech candidates? How do you stand out when you're a startup? And maybe if you could reference some of the experience that you guys have had in these great companies you've worked for.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. So I think really great early stage recruiting is primarily centered around two things. So the first thing is really narrative building and storytelling. And the second is building really deep resonance between candidates and not just your mission, but the actual team, the people delivering against that mission. So, from a storytelling perspective, before you convince candidates to sign a contract, you need to convince them that your journey is meaningful and that they're going to be playing a meaningful part of this. And in my own experience, there are a bunch of interesting frameworks that you can use as a recruiter to really start to tell that story from a brand perspective. I think, starting with a problem, talking to the problem space that you're addressing or the conflict within the problem space is the first thing, and giving that exposition, the bird's eye view that paints the picture of the world of incumbent solutions that don't work is a really good starting point. And then kind of moving forwards into, the traction and the progress that you've made thus far on addressing that, and actually transitioning towards putting the candidate in the position of the solution. So starting to speak about how the challenges and barriers that you have to success in solving that problem are problems that the candidate is going to be well positioned to help your team with. So, you're kind of telling the story from this position of the candidate as the protagonist and the person who's going to be really making an impact in delivering against the mission that you've you've started to go against. So I think that those things, from my perspective, like that ability to tell a coherent story and for there to be consistency with the hiring managers in terms of how they're speaking to that as well, is super integral to doing this well.
Really love that, the candidate as the protagonist. I think it's actually a really big marketing principle of like try and put the user first there. You touched on a little bit about the hiring managers. So I think for talent teams, I think they probably understand this kind of stuff, but sometimes it can be quite difficult to get the hiring managers on board with it. Has anyone got any sort of tips about how you can get potentially engineering leaders to buy into this kind of narrative?
I think I'm probable we spent quite a lot of time building candidate attraction packs when we were competing against some of the more reputable big tech companies out there and looking for like top engineering talent. We found that really being able to sell, and to your point, George, like sell a compelling story. We shared them with outreach, but we also showed through data that if a hiring manager was outreaching to a candidate with this pack, we got 40-50% better response rates, which again kind of clicked into that kind of personal approach to attraction. So that's some way we kind of brought data to the table to convince our managers that they can be more involved in the recruiting rather than it just being a kind of talent problem to solve.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely echo both of those things, particularly with storytelling. I think now more than ever, sort of selling your mission and humanizing it is so important for tech candidates, particularly for early stage companies, where you're still competing against more established brands, right? I think that's always been a challenge, but now more than ever, where we've gone through what feels like polycrisis after another, right? I think it's really important that you tell that story really succinctly. And I think on a practical level, when I think about Hopin, we completed interview stages incredibly fast. I mean, it goes without saying, but pace still wins. Now, don't get me wrong, I do realize that we were very uniquely positioned in that we were one of very few organizations hiring during lockdown. And of course, our platform was talking about connecting people. So it was a great narrative that we could bring to candidates. But pace was something that we never took for granted and continue to push forward. So that allowed us to sort of hire consistently in excess of 30, 40 engineers a month. And this is when we were still sub 500 as an entire company. So I think that's quite important. One of the things that I was actually reflecting on is how I actually built the recruitment team. And for a number of our recruiters, they were actually interviewed by our VP of engineering as well. And that's something that sort of I remembered, in that sort of getting our engineering leaders looped into our interview processes for recruiters kind of got them excited about that outreach and their potential in sort of bringing talent into the business. And I think finally what I'd say is that certainly when we were building the earliest teams at Hopin, we had a slightly higher appetite for risk as to what perfect looks like as far as candidates are concerned. So I think very often you get bogged down in trying to find everything in the skill set, whereas, and I think this is where the market is really heading now, we were thinking, can we teach someone? Are you coachable? Are you trainable? Have you got sort of the baseline skill set? And if so, yes, we need to bring you in and we'll do the rest, sort of thing. So I think that these kind of three factors really enabled a joined up approach to hiring amazing tech talent quite quickly.
It's very much so the zeitgeist at the moment of the sort of skills-based hiring in inverted commas. I think it's great if organizations as a whole kind of buy into that, but what are there any tips that we might be able to give to people where organizations are very wedded to, maybe they're hiring PHP engineers and they must have PHP experience? And how do you get particularly engineering leaders probably to think a little bit wider in terms of how they might approach the hiring challenges?
Yeah, so I think the way that our interview processes were designed, and I think this is fairly atypical for hiring engineering candidates, for example, is that you assess coding skills. And of course, if you're tied to a coding language, often your environment is tied to that. So I think by sort of opening that up, and then obviously systems design, and actually we found that the systems design thinking was potentially more impactful than just coding. And I think just reiterating the message that when you sign up to a role in technology, and our leaders know this, it's a constant learning cycle, right? And I think if syntax or a coding language is the one thing that you get them stuck on, you will find yourself locked into a market of engineers that you will then find particularly hard to come out of. So I think a lot of it was also just showcasing talent that is out there. So I guess PHP, you could potentially show Ruby candidates, you could potentially show Node.js candidates, and show the excellence that's out there and keep on pushing. I can't say that it was easy. It took a fairly long time to sort of convince that, but once we did land that message, honestly, the pools of talent that we had access to was infinitely better. So I think showcase and trial it out. You know, yeah.
I think one of the things that we do at Lindus Health is kind of over-index on problem-solving ability and view, specific expertise in, a certain framework or programming language to not be the outcome that we're looking for necessarily, but to be a vehicle to deliver a specific solution. So it's like a very product-oriented mindset of let's hire polyglot engineers, build this melting pot of different expertise. The likelihood is that on a journey from 30 staff to 300 staff, there are going to be lots of changes in terms of the technology that's involved in building our product and the complexity with which it as it grows. So, very early in over-indexing on that problem-solving ability and someone's propensity to learn new technology is super advantageous later down the line, because, the problems you have now aren't the problems you're going to have later down the line. There are going to be things that you're not thinking about right now that are going to be burning platforms in 2-3 years' time, and having that expertise, which maybe isn't on your list of requirements right now, is going to be super advantageous when you get to that stage.
Mm-hmm. I think coming at it from a slightly different angle is also just looking at like what are the competitors doing in the market space, like from a market mapping perspective, like how are other companies growing their engineering talent or any other talent, like where are they taking people from and where are they finding people from? I think can also have a compelling impact on those hiring managers, because it opens their eyes a bit to like what other people are doing. And if they're hiring agnostic engineers and you're only looking, obviously the example is PHP, you may open yourself up to a different mindset to what you said there, George.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point.
And I think also, sorry, Phil, I think internally more and more people are thinking about programs of work like reskilling, right? And I know you might think that startups, do we have the capabilities internally to reskill? But there's also internal mobility that's really important. And I think something that you can consider, particularly whilst we are looking at skill sets. Are there people that you can move from a different part of the org that can then sort of feed into your engineering capability? And I think we need to think more and more about your actual talent that you've got in-house already.
Mm-hmm. So maybe looking at startups' sort of competitiveness in the market. I don't know what I'm talking about. So one of the hardest things when you're recruiting for early stage startups is that you're recruiting for unknown brands. So, and particularly at the moment, I guess there is a certain risk aversion probably in general in the market. How can startups compete in this kind of market against maybe the kind of the safe havens of Lloyd's and the maybe not FANG companies, but some of the more corporate ones? Any thoughts on that?
I think we did something quite successful and probable when I was working there, where we were very much kind of positioning ourselves as a games company. And we're building games. We had them in kind of prototype phase. Engineers that we were targeting were typically from those FANG companies. We couldn't compete on comp. We couldn't compete on stability. But what we could compete on is like, are you driven to want to work for a company that has a really strong mission and has a good direction of where they want to go? So we actually sent a kind of like key for Steam, where people could log in and play our game as a prototype. And we sent that out to a number of like the top 10% of people in the country that we wanted to target to get them to play our game. And then say, hey, if you want to have a chat with us, this is who you should reach out to. And we got an incredible response rate where it was like so unique. And I think going back to your point, George, you said 10 or 15 minutes ago around like getting them brought into that story and that journey, it really plugged into that like mission driven, where people had enough of working in a big machine and they actually wanted to have more of an impact, and that's what we could offer. And I think that's how we kind of came at that a little bit, really driving down to like the mission of the organization.
Yeah, I think on your point there, Phil, around kind of risk appetite or risk aversion in the current market, in my view, the most pragmatic thing you can be doing to mitigate against lower response rates, lower candidate conversion as a product of that risk aversion is to be proactively mitigating against those risks in the hiring process, rather than waiting for candidates to come to you and flag specific things. So, it's important to provide that information without being prompted by candidates, because the inherent perception of recruiters as salespeople makes the message less authentic if you're answering the question rather than coming at them with the information organically. So in very tactical terms, what that could mean is, looking at your job specifications as a startup and ensuring you're clearly presenting the metrics that you're comfortable sharing that validate your traction or your business health or your MRR growth or whatever that might be. It might mean hiring managers proactively speaking to the desired growth of the team longer term without waiting for candidates at the end of the interview to say, so are there plans to grow the team? Are you going to be hiring out, other people in this team? And I think the other thing is that, for lots of startups right now, it's really easy to view startups as a risky bet broadly. But if you're in a position as a business where you're raising a meaningful Series A or Series B in the current economic climate, in many ways, you're likely to fly over the turbulence of the macroeconomic cycle that's happening. So that's something really worth mentioning. And I think as a brand custodian for your company as a recruiter, it's really important to flag that when you're speaking to candidates without having to get that prompt from them in the immediate term.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say and agree with all of those points. I think what I was thinking about is definitely mission and storytelling. So going back to what George was saying, I think when I think about some of the startups that I've worked with, aside from Hopin, I think connecting candidates with the kind of human touch about why we exist in the first place has been really critical. Sometimes that's born out of a fairly sad story. I think, Hopin's founder had a terrible time, and that's why he started the platform. But I was fairly transparent about that in, the storyteller and the narrative. And I think also to echo what George said, I think one of the things that we did really well was be fairly explicit about our numbers where we could be, right? So instead of, particularly for senior level candidates, but really for everyone, what our journey is, what we're hoping to do, because I think starting at startups, I get it. It's risky. I think I would argue that's for any job at the moment. I think, if you're sort of stable right now, moving feels like quite a big risk, whatever size company you're going to. But I think sharing projections and business outlooks and metrics, etc., even if you're not profitable, I think that sort of story and being transparent wins a lot of things with candidates on the market. And I think something that is super important that you do.
Yeah, I think the other really important consideration here, and something that flips the risk aversion conversation on its head, if you have strong metrics and you have market validation, be it through strong revenue growth or an investment round or both, is speaking to the opportunity cost of not joining your team if you have those things in place, right? World-changing companies are still being built right now. Like, there isn't some strange hiatus on those companies being created right now. So if you believe as a recruiter that you are in one of those companies, the opportunity cost of not joining one of those rocket ships, which still exist given the current market, it's really important to highlight.
That's great. So maybe moving on to what we might be able to learn from bigger companies or from enterprises. Now, all of you have worked in smaller companies, but also in bigger companies as well, so can uniquely talk to that. Are there some good things about enterprise businesses that maybe startups could use to give themselves a competitive advantage?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a number of advantages working enterprise. And I think when I think about Lloyd's, brand reputation means that there's sort of no pitch that you have to make to sort of, explain what we do. It's fairly clear, and, the mission is fairly strong in helping Britain prosper, right? It's kind of short and snappy. But I think what enterprise do is invest in certain toolkit that perhaps where you're resource poor in startups, you might not think about. Now, one of the things that I would say is LinkedIn Recruiter seems to be your standardized tool, right? That you sort of ask for your license and that's what you get. What I will say is that when we used Gem, for example, that was a game changer for us because that allowed us to actually run campaign-led recruitment, which I actually think enterprise can do very well. So I think that's one of the key learnings. Look at your toolkit and your infrastructure. You might not have all the benefits of having a branding team and people who can help get that collateral out to you and hit mass market, but think very consciously about your toolkit. And I think, you know, Gem or Avatar or any of these sort of CRMs that you can utilize, just think fairly meaningful about that.
Yeah, and I think outside of the tools, there's also a point here around the expertise that you can leverage in a larger business, right? And you know, one of the most profoundly impactful things that happened to me when I was going from like 30 staff to 100 staff at CloudReach, where I used to work, was you know, the involvement of, you know, someone specifically oriented towards onboarding, which you don't have in a really early stage team. Someone specifically oriented towards, you know, making sure that the hiring forecast was aligned with the financial forecast. And I think there's obviously, as you say, Yvonne, like huge implications and value in having being able to afford the right toolkit, but also being able to have de facto experts in their respective space rather than specific remits being owned by a generalist or maybe not even being owned at all. Like that kind of thing is really impactful. And, you know, it's something you can start to think about early stage in terms of like more proactivity around headcount planning or onboarding or whatever the case might be, and making sure everything's joined up neatly. But I don't think you can really do it well until you have people who are de facto experts in that. And, you know, as you scale, you're afforded the opportunities to be able to bring in those kinds of people.
Yeah.
I think another thing to add there is around like consistent hiring approach, like where I've seen a lot of startups maybe get this wrong is where they kind of have bespoke processes across the business and they wait too long to create consistency. And I think where I've seen things work well is creating a consistent bar early, where you've got a similar framework that you follow as a company, which will allow you to scale in a much more controlled manner. And I think, like, to your point around tools and systems are really important. Like, what systems and tools are you buying at, you know, maybe 5 years as a startup that is that going to be applicable for 2-3 years down the line? But also things around salary banding that you tend to find in startups, they don't have salary bands, they don't have leveling. So the earlier you can do that in a company's evolution, the easier it becomes to scale, and you mitigate the amount of risk that may come in terms of making mistakes as a business.
Yeah, and I also think one of the things that I guess perhaps enterprise do really well is once you join an organization, you're sort of on your learning and development pathway from day dot, right? I think they really produce an environment where you think about this new company as a career, right? And they sort of show you your pathways, whether that be you take this route or you've got a squiggly career. But I think learning and development and pushing that as part of your experience is done sort of from the get-go, right? And I think that's really important to when you think about retention and things like that of the people that you're trying to attract, but also as part of your marketing campaigns as well, just really pushing L&D.
Some really great ideas here. I guess the question that's going around my head is, so much of this stuff is brilliant, but there's always a balance when you're in early stage. So how much can you actually do? Because there are limited budgets, limited people. I guess what are the kind of the absolute must-have things that you or could you advise on kind of what level we should do things like headcount planning, things like salary or compensation planning, that kind of thing? Any thoughts on what you've seen work there, or any tools that work really well to support you?
Yeah, I mean, headcount planning, I think, is an absolute must right now. You don't have to have any fancy tools to do it. Like, I think everyone has headcount plan off Excel or a spreadsheet before. But I think headcount planning is important because it sort of sets up your metrics for everything else, right? Without a plan, how do you build a team against it? Without a plan, how do you actually effectively look at how you're going to recruit across these roles and what skill sets we need for the business? So I think you have to sort of start there. I don't think you can get away with not doing that. But I don't think it has to be anything particularly exciting. At Lloyd's, we're still on Excel. So, you don't have to have anything bright and fancy as far as that's concerned. And I get it with other tools and things like that. I think the more established a business gets, the more access to things that you have. But I think that's one thing that I would say is an absolute must.
Yeah, I think my two, if I had to say two absolute must-do things on this point, like the first is salary bandings in terms of how you're presenting them externally for new candidates, but also how joined up that is with internal bandings and making sure that there's consistency with those things as you scale. And the second is actually like managing your employee stock option plan effectively. Like so many startups will be really fast and loose with awarding stock options early doors, and then they have to go back to their board at like Series B, Series C stage and be like, hey, can we allocate some more? Can we allocate more stock? Can we carve out some of your capital in order to award a very senior hire or like a glut of hires they want to be making in a certain team? So I think managing cap table, ESOP really early doors and managing your salary early doors are both super important.
So just on that point, George, I think as you're kind of talking about it, I'm thinking these are things that talent teams always want to do, but it's usually not talent teams that mess them up. It's usually execs that mess them up. So how do you kind of have those conversations? And how would you sort of explain to, I don't know, a C-level person that they must actually stick to this because,
Yeah, so I think like the precursor ingredient to this, I guess, is like having a really consistent, clear dialogue with your founders or with the C-suite team who input on this on a regular basis. So like making sure that you're having conversations around this stuff as early as possible and that there's a bilateral discourse on it, but also making sure that if you're early in a hiring process, particularly for a senior search, so for example, at Lindus, we're running a VP commercial search at the moment. It's by all accounts like a CCO kind of remit. Very early in the search, like calibrating with the founders and with the leadership team around what expectations look like from candidates after the first tranche of interviews that you've run on initial screens. And then moving forwards, I think if you do those things from the get-go, like you've parachuted in, that's the kind of level of discourse that you're having. It makes it much easier to have like a bigger conversation around that and to have a consistent conversation around that as you grow around other candidates and around managing the ESOP more broadly.
I think two key things for me really. One you touched on a bit there is like salary banding. Make sure that you're leveling correctly, because I think where you can come into complications in the future is where you've got kind of skill sets completely misaligned with comp and leveling, and it creates companies all sorts of headaches. And I think that comes back to consistent hiring approach. Like, what are your values as a company? How are you threading them into your kind of interviewing and assessment criteria? Because the earlier you can get that, you ensure that as you grow and you scale, at the heart of what you're looking for, like the values are ever present in how you assess, and those things don't change over 5-10 years. Like they change more infrequently than a lot of other things.
Yeah. Perfect. And I guess what's everyone's view on where the market is at the moment? Like, what are the challenges right now for startups hiring, and how are you sort of tackling those problems?
So I think the hiring market at the moment is probably the strangest hiring market I've seen in my career, because it feels as though we're at this really interesting point of recalibration. We had this shorter transitional phase post-COVID that was driven by like a shifting bias for specific working models and people trying to find work that had more purpose for them when they had more time to think over the course of the pandemic. And then following on from that, we're in this more protracted phase of layoffs in both enterprise and in early stage companies who are struggling to fundraise. So what that means, or I guess the second order effects of that from a talent perspective, are that there's more availability of talent. But what I'd say is that for companies, and I consider Lindus Health to be one of these companies, so I can only speak to my own experience, but the same principles apply as always have in attracting really strong talent, because everybody's still competing for that slither of the market. So, it's in my view like always quite straightforward to find the right people and to like populate a talent pool on LinkedIn and build a shortlist. But actually engaging that talent, that hasn't changed at all. That's still extremely difficult to do. And so, what Scott spoke to around like threading the values through, what we spoke to around storytelling, all of these principles are still as hugely important as they always have been. the challenge is now, or the difference, I suppose, is that there's a greater element of this filtering exercise in like identifying signal through a broader N of or sample size of candidates that are in the top of the hopper in your ATS. So it's the administrative burden is certainly higher, but I think the principal challenges around actually engaging really high caliber talent are still pretty much what they were before.
I found it. I also think it's a really bizarre market in that there's a lot more talent available, and off the back of big tech laying off so many candidates, I think a number of startups and scale-ups are probably seeing applicants from folks from these companies where I'm sure we've all experienced a hiring manager sort of saying, I want someone from Facebook and I want someone from Google. And you're like, really, why? Also, we can't afford them. Like, what are you doing? But we're seeing an influx of those applications. And actually, I think sort of discerning who is actually here for the long term has become tougher. And I think, George, you sort of spoke about that, knowing that you're speaking to someone who can be, engaged throughout the process, but understanding, are they actually going to be here for 3 to 5 years or until sort of the market recovers and you're off again, right? Because I think understanding, you're sort of thinking about retention during your early stage recruitment processes, but really understanding those folks that are here for the journey, I think has been quite tough to sort of figure out, right? Because I think you're seeing that influx of amazing talent, and it's great. It's great to see, but it's harder to sift through.
I think just looking at like a lot of the change I've seen in the last year has been around like macroeconomics impacting tech and stuff that's happening in the industry, in the markets. That's had a detrimental effect on a lot of bigger companies who are driven by profit. And I think there's been a huge shift from growth to profitability generally in the industry. And I think if I was working at a startup today, my pitch to candidates would be, hey, if we've got a good Series B or Series A or Series C funding round, like that's not going to change. Most startups aren't profitable. So they're aiming for profitability or finding product fit. So they need to treat the company like a research and development arm more so than profitability. So if you're in a much bigger company right now, I'd say you're actually probably more at risk because you are looked at more as a number rather than an individual. As in a startup, you don't have those risks because you're still driving a mission towards profitability in 2-3 years time. So in theory, yes, you may not earn the same comp, but you probably are in a more stable environment if those startups have that backing, that finance backing.
Okay. Excellent. Well, I'm going to keep this one short and sweet. I think we're at 33 minutes, and I think that was loads of insight there. So thank you all. Thanks so much, guests. And obviously, you can reach out to these guys on LinkedIn and ask them any other questions that you've got. So this was a Hire webinar. If you're not part of the Hire community at the moment, please join. We're at hirehq.com, and you can also download the Talent 100 list on the website as well to find out some insights from enterprise talent leaders across the US and Europe. So hopefully we'll see you again soon. Thanks, guys.
Bye.